how in the world does jealousy provoke the will of these hardened Jews so that they may be saved? Makes no sense on Calvinism as far as I can tell. Romans 9, 10, and 11 go together. You can't really separate their meaning, because the same Israelites who were hardened in chapter 9, who are stumbling in chapter 9 over the stumbling stone, who is Christ, they're stumbling over the fact they killed their own Messiah. I mean, it's really hard for them to bear this, to say, I didn't recognize my own Messiah and we actually had him killed. They're going to stumble over the stumbling stone, who is Christ. But they have not stumbled beyond recovery, according to Paul in Romans 11:11. Yes, they're hardened. Yes, they're cut off in their rebellion, but Paul holds out hope that his own ministry to the Gentiles will provoke them to envy, so that they too may see the error of their ways, leave their unbelief, and be grafted back in. Read chapter 11. So the hardened Israelites who are cut off in their rebellion aren't reprobates, because they actually have a hope of salvation, according to Paul. They can't be the reprobates, because reprobates are cut off unilaterally before they're born. So the people being represented in Romans 9 as hardened Israelites can't be representative of reprobates, at least in the mind of Paul, because why else would Paul hold out hope for them, pray for their salvation, and expect them not to stumble beyond recovery and leave their unbelief and be saved, if indeed they're representing the reprobates on the Calvinistic worldview. So chapter 10 kind of touches on this, and he says, but I ask, did Israel not understand? For Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. Okay, so I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. This is exactly what he refers to later in Romans chapter 11. I will make you jealous, and through envy, they may see the error of their ways. When they see the Gentiles' lives begin to change, and they may see something dramatic, like a prostitute becoming a faithful wife and mother, and now she's worshiping God with tears. She's worshiping the God of Israel, and her life changed. I want what she has, the Pharisee might think. I want to have what she has, and it's going to make him jealous. Then Isaiah was so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me, which is obviously a reference to the nations. Because I showed myself through the Israelites. But for the most part, at least he speaks in general terms, they rejected my message. And so I took the message to the Gentiles. And the hope is that through the salvation of the Gentiles, that also those who have become hardened in their rebellion, self-righteous rebellion against the things of God, will see the error of their ways, which is exactly what he goes on to speak about in Romans chapter 11. Let's just jump into there. Again, I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly, because I want you to see these in context. In Romans chapter 11, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I am myself an Israelite. Well, before we go to chapter 11, let me finish reading chapter 10. Look at the last verse of chapter 10. He says of Israel, God saying this, all day long I've held out my hands to disobedient and contrary people. So the imagery is God holding out his hands to someone. That's a longing. I want you, okay? Just like he holds out his hands to a toddler. A father holds out his hands to his toddler saying, I want you to come to me. If the toddler runs the other direction, imagine that father staying in that position all day long. That's the kind of imagery we have here from the prophet. Of God speaking. This is God speaking through the prophet, okay? All day long, I've held out my hands to you. All day long, I've been patient with you, okay? Even though you were disobedient and contrary. Now, that in itself flies in the face of Calvinism, because if you've got God longing for something that's not happening, then somehow, for some Calvinists, at least men like James White, would argue that God's failing because he's trying to get something he's not getting, and therefore mankind is somehow overpowering his will, versus recognizing, like C.S. Lewis and A.W. Tozer argue, that God in his sovereignty hasn't decided which choices we'll make, but that we'll be free to make choices. Just like a father can choose to allow a child to make his own choice. Doesn't make him less of a father, doesn't make him less strong than his children. It just simply says he has the right to govern and to parent his children the way he wants to. And in the same way, God has the right to allow for people to have the choice as to whether to worship him or to rebel. And these people are disobedient and contrary despite his longing for them, despite his provisions for them, and despite his grace. Now jump into verse 1 of chapter 11. I ask then, has God rejected his people? Because that might be the conclusion. Look, they're stumbling, they're hardened, they're cut off in their unbelief. So God's rejected those hardened stumblers. He's rejected the hardened stumblers, right? By no means, for I am myself an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Now, what does foreknew, prognosko, mean here? I think it means the same thing as it does back in chapter 8, which we'll get to later. It means those known in the past. That's what foreknow, basic definition, is having knowledge of something formally, knowing somebody in the past. And we actually have several quotes in the articles that we've written referencing to Acts and Paul using prognosko in that sense, that you knew me in my former days. You knew me in the past. Well, in the same way, God hasn't rejected his people whom he's known throughout the ages. He's known these people. Do you not know, as the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and they've demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and I seek my life. So what is Elijah feeling? I'm alone. I'm the only one. All of the other Israelites, the chosen people, have abandoned you, God, and I am all by myself. I am the only one who's believing. And therefore, you must have failed, God. Your promise must have failed. What is Paul referring to this history lesson? He's trying to demonstrate back from chapter 9, verse 6. Has God's promise failed? Elijah thinks it's failed, just like the people today in Paul's day is thinking it must have failed. God's promise, his purpose in electing Israel must have failed because Elijah's saying, I'm the only one left. And a lot of people in Paul's day might be saying, nobody's left. Israel has is not fulfilling the purpose in which God's chosen them. It must have all failed. And that's exactly what Elijah is feeling here. I'm all by myself. They seek my life. And I guess your promise, your purpose through electing Israel has totally failed. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed a knee to Baal. Now, when I was a Calvinist, what I heard when I read that verse is God effectually unilaterally chose, before the foundation of the world, 7,000 men. And that's the reason they did not bow a knee to Baal. In other words, they were faithful because God chose them. Okay? So God chose them before they were ever born, and he kept those people for himself. And that's why they were faithful. Now, does the verse say that? No, but that's what I was taught it meant. Okay? What does it say? It says these are faithful men. And what does God do with faithful men? He keeps them for himself. So if a person refuses to bow a knee to Baal, what's God going to do? He's going to keep them for himself. He's going to use them to bring about his purpose. But 7,000 in the midst of millions is just a drop in the bucket. It's just a small group of people. But for Elijah to know there's 7,000 other men who are also remaining faithful, who are also out there being used by God to bring about the purpose for which God elected the nation of Israel, then it gives me hope. As Elijah gives Elijah the prophet hope. There are 7,000 other people who are remaining faithful. And God's going to use them to bring about his purpose. And it's not just on me. Okay? So there's 7,000 men who have not bowed a knee to Baal. Verse 5. So too at the present time, there's a remnant chosen by grace. Now, again, as a Calvinist, what you read is, so too at the present time, there are people unilaterally picked before the foundation of the world, and they're chosen by grace to remain faithful. In other words, God is going to make them faithful through an effectual work of grace. Does it say that? No, but that's the way you read it from a Calvinist lens. But listen to what it goes on to say. But if it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Now, if you read works in here, and you read as Piper does, works means faith, then I can understand how Calvinists come to this conclusion. It's because they say, oh, if it's by grace, and it's no longer on the basis of whether you believe or don't believe, but it's on the basis of effectual grace, and only effectual grace. But that's not what's in the mind of Paul. What Paul is saying, but if it's by grace for those who believe, then it's no longer on the basis of your own works and your own righteousness. That's the comparison in Paul's mind. You've got to see it. It's just the lenses by which you're looking at this verse. If you're just assuming Calvinism and you assume that faith is just another work, just another condition by which we're not considered, like we went through the parable, then you can see how a Calvinist might come to that conclusion. But it gets stronger here. Keep listening. It's not over. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. Now, what a lot of Calvinists will hear is they'll say, oh, the elect obtained it. Why did they obtain it? Because they were unilaterally picked before the foundation of the world and effectually caused to obtain it, right? God effectually causes them to believe, and therefore that's why they're obtaining it. And the rest are hardened. The rest are the reprobate. So you got the elect versus the reprobate, just plain and simple here. But look at the context. Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking, speaking nationally, corporately here. Okay, so Israel, generally speaking, not all of them, obviously there's 7,000 who did not bow a knee to Baal, There are a remnant in the time of the New Testament. So it's not everyone, even on Calvinist position. But Israel, generally speaking, are not obtaining what they're seeking because they're working for it through righteousness. They're striving after the law. But the elect, those clothed in the righteousness of Christ, many are called, few are elect. So remember, the few who are elect are not just elect arbitrarily before the foundation of the world for no apparent reason. They are elect because they believe, okay? They're clothed in the righteousness of Christ. The elect, the believers, obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So in other words, what it's saying is the believers obtained it, but the unbelievers were hardened in their unbelief. Do you see the dichotomy in Paul's mind? So when Paul says the elect, he's talking about those who have responded in faith. They have obtained it. Why? Because they refused to bow a knee to Baal. They remained faithful, and so they have obtained it. The rest, those who refused to bow a knee to, and those who did bow a knee to Baal, those who did build the golden calf, so to speak, those who did remain in their unbelief, they were hardened in that unbelief. Now, I can prove what I'm saying is true versus the Calvinist reading by just reading, because what you have here is a dichotomy set up by Paul, the elect versus the rest. Okay, right? You got the elect versus the rest. I think that is very clearly the believers versus the unbelievers, right? What the Calvinist means, it's the unconditionally chosen before the foundation of the world elect versus the reprobate, those who are chosen for damnation before they're ever born, okay? That's what they hear. Which one does the text bear out? Keep reading. Romans 8 goes on to say, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear, down to this very day. Now, we believe that's a reflection on the hardening of Israel, where he's removing the light from those who are already rebellious. So if they bow a knee to Baal, they're not faithful, then God can cut them off in their rebellion. God will not contend with men forever. Their hearts grow defiled, they grow hardened, they grow callous, their consciences become seared. He can cut them off in that rebellion, send them a spirit of stupor, keep them in their rebellion so as to accomplish his good purposes through their rebellious behaviors. Perfectly just to do that. It's a judicial hardening. It's an act of a judge to harden somebody because of their choices, not that he is making them make those choices so as to accomplish his purpose. No, he's using them in their free choices and their rebellion to bring about his purposes through them. Okay, verse 9, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. So who is he talking about still? He's talking about the rest who are hardened. Keep that in mind. That's still who he's quoting passages referencing the rest who were hardened. Okay. Oh, verse 11. So I asked, did they, who's they? The rest who were hardened. Okay. That's who he's talking about still. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they may fall? In other words, did they stumble beyond recovery? Some translations say, by no means. There's your answer right there. The fact that the reprobates fall unconditionally and cannot be restored prove that that's not in the mind of Paul. He is comparing the believer versus the unbeliever, and he's saying even the hardened unbeliever has not stumbled beyond recovery. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will the full inclusion mean? What's he saying? If their rebellion, failure, crying out, crucify him, if their rebellion brought about redemption through Calvary and the riches for the Gentiles being engrafted, how much more will those same people who cried out, crucify him, who later leave their unbelief and become saved, how much more will their inclusion be, given that they are from the seed of Israel? That's what he's talking about. Verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I'm an apostle to Gentiles. I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. Now, why in the world would he need to provoke their wills to jealousy if election on the Calvinistic worldview is true? God elects and regenerates certain people and leaves the rest in their natural, inborn, unbelieving state. How in the world does jealousy provoke the will of these hardened Jews so that they may be saved? Makes no sense on Calvinism, as far as I can tell. It seems to me what he's saying is that those hardened, stumbled unbelievers, the rest who were hardened, might be provoked to jealousy through the ministry of the Gentiles when the Gentiles come in, so that they too might be saved. For if their rejection, who's there? The rest who are hardened. If their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, in other words, if the rest who were hardened, their rejection brought about the crucifixion, it brought resurrection, the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? In other words, there's still hope, even for these hardened, stumbling Jews. If Paul is holding out hope for them, then how in the world could they be, in his mind at least, the reprobate of Calvinism? I don't see how rationally you read it that way. Verse 16, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and who are the branches that were broken off? The rest who were hardened in verse 7. Okay, so they were broken off. So they're unconditionally, unilaterally chosen for damnation before they were born, and nothing can change that, right? Read on. And although a wild olive shoot were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who supports the root, but the root that supports you. In other words, you believing Gentiles don't get haughty and jealous, or don't get haughty and prideful because you're in the vine. Remember, they are natural branches. How much more so could they be grafted back in? Verse 19, then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. So why were they broken off? Because before they were ever born or did anything good or bad, they were chosen for reprobation, right? No, Paul doesn't say that. They were broken off for a reason. They were broken off for their unbelief. And we're talking about the rest who were hardened. They're hardened in their already unbelief state because of their own choices. But you stand fast through faith. So the reason they stand fast is because of faith. So don't become proud, but fear. For the God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief. So notice who's they? The rest who are hardened, right? Verse 7, the rest who are hardened, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. So God has the power to graft in the rest who are hardened if they leave their unbelief. Because if they leave their unbelief, then what do they become? Clothed in the righteousness of Christ. They become the elect, right? So when you understand this, the lights come on. And you go, oh, okay, this is not about reprobation versus election. This is about belief versus unbelief. And anyone can believe because the gospel is very clear. The revelation of God's very, very clear. And these things become a lot more easy to follow when you understand that.